Somewhere in a garage in the American Midwest, there is a box on a shelf. The plastic is yellowed at the corners. The price sticker from a hobby shop that no longer exists is still on the side. Inside, the balsa ribs are still perfectly die-cut. Interlocked, precision fit, designed by a mechanical engineer who built the machine to cut them himself because no such machine had ever existed before. The box says Great Plains on the lid. For 30 years, that name meant something specific. It meant the hobby shop down the street had a wall of them. It meant a Saturday afternoon and the smell of model cement and the sound of a small engine turning over on a flying field somewhere in America. Then one Wednesday morning in January 2018, 332 people showed up for work at a building in Champaign, Illinois, and the company that owned Great Plains filed for bankruptcy before lunch. This is how it happened. In the early 1970s, Champaign, Illinois was a university town with a good engineering school and not much else to recommend it industrially. The cornfields ran almost to the edge of campus. The city's economic identity was tied to the University of Illinois, its enrollment, its research grants, its football Saturdays. Nobody looked at Champaign and saw a future industrial capital. Don Anderson did not set out to build one. He came to the University of Illinois as a mechanical engineering student, the kind of young man who was more comfortable with tolerances and load calculations than with abstract theory. He grew up in Paris, Illinois, a small town 2 hours south, building models in the way boys of his generation did, with patience and glue and the particular satisfaction of a part that fit exactly where it was supposed to fit. When he arrived on campus, he lived across the hall from a fellow student named Bruce Holochek. They shared two things immediately: a passion for golf and a deeper passion for radio-controlled aircraft. They would fly RC planes near the assembly hall and crash them in Mount Hope Cemetery and consider it a fine afternoon. After graduation in 1971, Anderson did what mechanical engineers did. He went to work at Pontiac Motor Division at General Motors, testing bumpers and running a dynamometer lab and setting up cars for emissions evaluations. It was steady work, good work even, but it was not his work. What pulled him back to Champaign was partly his friend and partly a problem he could not stop thinking about. Holochek had started a mail-order hobby business called Tower Hobbies out of Champaign in 1971, selling RC products direct to modelers across the country. The business was growing fast, but Anderson had noticed something that bothered him as an engineer. The model aircraft kits on the market were poorly made. The parts did not fit the way parts should fit. The wood was inconsistent. The construction required a builder to compensate constantly for the manufacturer's imprecision, sanding down a rib here, shimming a spar there, accepting that the finished airframe would be a negotiation between what the designer intended and what the materials actually allowed. For a man trained to hold tolerances, this was not acceptable. Prior to the founding of Great Plains, no machinery specifically for cutting model aircraft parts had ever been designed. Anderson intended to change that. He returned to Champaign in 1973 and started Great Plains Model Distributors, initially working the supply chain between manufacturers and hobby shops. But the manufacturing problems stayed with him. In 1981, he decided to go into manufacturing and purchased Bridey Hobby Enterprises, then a year later purchased Andrews Model Aircraft Company. Both acquisitions were the raw material for something larger. What Anderson built from those two struggling companies was the first RC kit manufacturer to use computer-aided drafting to design airframes with interlocked construction. Parts that were cut with such precision they snapped together and held their alignment without the builder having to fight the material. Great Plains became the first company of its type to create such machines. Fully framed, sheeted, almost ready-to-fly models became possible. A kit that once demanded 60 hours of skilled labor could now be assembled by a man with moderate experience and a good weekend. The hobby shop owners noticed, the modelers noticed, the flying fields on the edge of every mid-sized American city noticed. By 1984, Anderson was making money, real money, from airplane kits. Interest rates and costs continued to drag at profits, but the trajectory was clear. That year, a businessman named Clint Atkins, who had acquired Tower Hobbies from Holochek, came to Anderson with a proposition. He wanted to combine the two Champaign companies, Tower's distribution reach and Great Plains manufacturing precision, into a single operation. Anderson sold. Hobbico was started in 1985 when Tower Hobbies was combined with Great Plains Model Distributors to form Hobbico, Inc. The new company was headquartered in Champaign. It controlled distribution. It controlled manufacturing. It had the catalog, Tower Hobbies, that reached modelers in every zip code in America. What it did not yet know was that across town in the same year, a former Hobbico employee named Louis Stevens had just walked out the door and started a competing hobby distributor of his own. The company was called Horizon Hobby. For a long time, that fact seemed like nothing more than a footnote. By the late 1980s, if you walked into a hobby shop anywhere in America, and there were thousands of them then, anchored in strip malls and downtown storefronts from Spokane to Savannah. You would find it. The Great Plains Wall. It was not always called that, but every hobby shop owner knew what it meant. A vertical run of bright-colored kit boxes, stacked floor to ceiling, organized by skill level and aircraft type. Trainers on the bottom left, sport planes in the middle, scale warbirds and giant-scale aerobats up top, where the serious builders reached. The boxes had clean graphic design, precise photography, and a logo that communicated something specific to the men who bought them. This company knows what it is doing. The target customer was not a child. He was a man in his 30s or 40s who had been building models since boyhood and had graduated to powered flight. He had a flying field membership. He drove out on Saturday mornings with a truck bed full of equipment. He spent real money on engines, on radio systems, on fuel, on replacement parts. And he came back to the hobby shop every few weeks because there was always something else to buy, something else to build, something else to tune. Great Plains understood him completely. The company's in-house research and development team was comprised of active hobbyists, experienced builders, and champion RC pilots. These were not marketing men guessing at what flyers wanted. They were flyers themselves, and it showed in the product. The interlocked balsa construction that Anderson had engineered in the early 1980s meant that a Great Plains kit went together the way a well-designed machine should, with confidence, with feedback, with the particular satisfaction of a part that seated exactly where it belonged. A man named Ray, the kind of builder who showed up at the flying field an hour before anyone else to walk the runway and check the wind, bought his first Great Plains kit in 1987. He chose the PT-40 trainer, the company's signature beginner aircraft, a high-wing monoplane in yellow and white that had become the standard introduction to RC flight for a generation of American hobbyists. He built it over 3 weekends at the kitchen table while his kids slept. When it flew the first time, he drove back to the hobby shop the following Saturday and bought 2 more boxes. He was not unusual. By the late 1970s, Tower Hobbies stocked radio control hobby products from over 150 different manufacturers and had more than 35,000 active customers. The company's warehouse processed over 350 packages every day. By the time the 1980s peaked, those numbers had grown considerably. The Tower Hobbies catalog, a thick, dense publication that landed in mailboxes across America like a seasonal event, was the primary commercial connection between Great Plains' manufacturing floor in Champaign and the modelers who built their products on kitchen tables and workbenches from coast to coast. Prior to 1972, there were only 3 people employed in the model airplane business in Champaign-Urbana. By the time of Anderson's Hall of Fame nomination, there were in excess of 1,000 employees. The city had become something it had never planned to be, the RC capital of America. Not by accident and not by outside investment, but because 2 college students had crashed an airplane in a cemetery and refused to stop thinking about what a better one would look like. The Hobbico campus on Research Road reflected what the business had become. Multiple facilities, a warehouse operation that moved product at a scale no independent hobby distributor could match, an engineering department staffed by people who flew what they designed. The company had expanded into RC cars, RC boats, RC helicopters, but the airplane remained the soul of the brand. Great Plains was not just a product line, it was the reason Hobbico existed. In November 2005, the company became a 100% employee-owned ESOP, an employee stock ownership plan. For the workers on the floor and in the offices at Research Road, this was not a financial abstraction. It was a promise. The company they worked for belonged to them. The value they built every year accumulated in an account with their name on it. It was, in the language of the American Midwest, a good place to work. A place you stayed. A place you told your brother-in-law about when he was looking. Across town, Horizon Hobby was growing quietly. Different product lines, different distribution relationships, same city, same industry, same customer base. Nobody at Hobbico spent much time thinking about Horizon. They had no reason to. The orders were still coming in. The catalog was still landing in mailboxes. The Great Plains Wall was still in every hobby shop in America. None of them knew the weight the company had started carrying. The trouble with building an empire is that empires require maintenance. By the mid-2000s, Hobbico had become something Don Anderson almost certainly never imagined when he was cutting balsa ribs in a Champaign workshop in 1981. The company was the largest distributor of radio-controlled and hobby products in the United States. It employed hundreds of people across multiple facilities. It had international reach. It had brands, dozens of them, spanning every category a hobby shop might stock. And it had appetite. In May 2007, Hobbico acquired Revell Monogram, the famous maker of Revell plastic model kits. This was not a small acquisition. Revell Monogram was one of the most recognized names in American hobby history. a brand that predated Hobbico by decades, with its own manufacturing infrastructure, its own distribution relationships, its own legacy workforce. Folding it into the Champagne operation required capital, management bandwidth, and the kind of institutional patience that expansion rarely allows. 3 years later, the appetite returned. In January 2010, Hobbico acquired model rocket maker Estes Industries. Estes was another iconic American brand, the company that had put model rocketry into the hands of a generation of American children, the brand whose catalog sat beside Great Plains on hobby shop walls for 30 years. Another acquisition, another integration, another layer of complexity added to a company that had been built, at its core, around the elegant simplicity of a well-cut balsa kit. Each acquisition made sense on paper. Each one expanded Hobbico's reach into adjacent categories. Each one made the company look from the outside like a healthy and growing enterprise. What they made from the inside was heavier. The hobby retail landscape was also beginning to shift in ways that no acquisition could address. The independent hobby shop, the strip mall anchor with the Great Plains wall and the owner who knew every regular customer by name, had begun a slow retreat that most industry insiders either did not see or did not want to acknowledge. Big box retailers had entered the hobby space with lower prices and no expertise. Online sellers were undercutting the shops that had, for decades, been Hobbico's primary distribution channel. A man who once drove 20 minutes to his local hobby shop on a Saturday morning could now order the same kit from his kitchen table and have it arrive by Wednesday. The hobby shop owners felt it first. Margins compressed, foot traffic declined. The regulars still came, but the casual buyers, the fathers who wandered in with a curious child, the men who had lapsed from the hobby and come back, were harder to find. Shops that had operated for 20 and 30 years began closing quietly, one by one, in cities across America. And then came something no one in the RC airplane business had anticipated: the drone. Not the serious, expensive, technically demanding multi-rotor aircraft that RC enthusiasts had been flying for years, but the inexpensive Chinese-manufactured, ready-to-fly consumer quadcopter that appeared on retail shelves and Amazon listings around 2013 and 2014. It required no building, no mechanical knowledge, no flying field membership, no balsa, no fuel, no radio system purchased separately. A man could take it out of the box in a parking lot and have it airborne in 10 minutes. It was, by every technical measure, an inferior experience to what Great Plains had spent 3 decades perfecting. It sold by the millions. The customer who might have walked into a hobby shop and bought a PT-40 trainer and spent a winter building it and a spring learning to fly it, now bought a consumer quadcopter instead. The experience was shallower, the satisfaction was briefer, but it was available immediately, and immediacy had become the dominant currency of American consumer culture. At Hobbico's facilities on Research Road, the numbers began telling a story that management did not want to hear. The company would later say it filed for bankruptcy because it had added too much debt as it grew and ran into issues with suppliers. But the debt and the supplier problems were symptoms. The underlying condition was structural. The market that had built Hobbico was contracting, and the acquisitions that were supposed to broaden the company's base had instead deepened its obligations. The ESOP, the employee stock ownership plan that had made Hobbico feel like something its workers genuinely owned, was quietly losing value. They called it a temporary adjustment. It was not temporary. The workers at Hobbico did not learn about the collapse from management. They learned about it from their retirement accounts. In the year before the bankruptcy filing, employees noticed that the value of the company's employee stock ownership program had declined by more than 80%, and the U.S. Department of Labor opened an investigation into deferred ESOP payments. For the men and women who had spent years, in some cases careers, at the Research Road facility, this was not an abstract financial disclosure. The ESOP had been the promise at the center of their employment. The reason a skilled worker stayed at Hobbico when other opportunities existed. The reason a man put in overtime and called it an investment. An 80% decline did not feel like a market correction. It felt like a betrayal. The murmur started in late 2016. People compared numbers in the break room. HR offered explanations that explained nothing. The executive communications, careful, measured, optimistic in tone, described challenges being addressed and strategies being pursued. Workers who had been at Hobbico long enough to read the language between the lines began updating their resumes. Some did not wait to see what happened next. At the manufacturing floor and in the distribution warehouses, the physical signals were harder to ignore than the financial ones. Orders that once moved at a pace that required every shift to run full did not move that way anymore. Product lines that had always sold through quickly sat longer in the warehouse. Reorder cycles lengthened. The particular rhythm of a busy distribution operation, the forklift traffic, the packing station noise, the constant roll of conveyor systems, had a different quality to it now. Quieter, more deliberate, like a machine running below its design load. The hobby shop operators who had carried Great Plains products for decades were feeling it too. The customers who still came were loyal, the serious builders, the men who had been flying RC airplanes since the Carter administration. But the pipeline of new hobbyists that had once replenished the customer base was not filling the way it once had. A hobby shop owner in Ohio who had stocked Great Plains kits since 1989 told anyone who would listen that his best customers were getting older and nobody was coming in behind them. The average age on the flying field had been rising for 10 years. He had watched it happen and had no answer for it. Neither did Hobbico. The drone market that had seemed like an opportunity, a new category to distribute, a new customer to reach, turned out to be a trap. The Chinese manufacturers who made the consumer quadcopters that were moving through Amazon and big box retailers had no interest in the traditional hobby distribution model. They sold direct or through mass market channels at price points that Hobbico's cost structure could not match. The company had spent years acquiring brands and building infrastructure predicated on a retail ecosystem that was dissolving faster than anyone had publicly acknowledged. The acquisitions that had looked like strength now looked like weight. Revell Monogram's plastic model kit business was contracting. The Estes rocketry line was stable but modest. The Tower Hobbies catalog, once the lifeline between Great Plains manufacturing floor and the American modeler, was increasingly competing against online retailers who could undercut it on price and match it on selection. Hobbico President Louis Brownstone said the company decided to pursue Chapter 11 reorganization and attempt to attract new capital investment after steps taken to date did not sufficiently address its challenges. The language was corporate and measured. What it described was a company that had run out of runway. On January 10, 2018, Hobbico filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing put at risk the jobs of 332 workers at its Champaign-Urbana facilities. The notice went to employees before the public announcement. Some learned about it from the news before the internal memo arrived. A man named Rick Burris, who worked as a model technician at the facility, had already seen enough. He had started looking for another job before Horizon Hobby took over. He started somewhere else that week. He had a fear that something like this would happen, he said, so he bit the bullet and took another job. He was not alone in his fear. He was simply faster than most in acting on it. The bankruptcy filing listed between 200 and 999 creditors. The company had 5 facilities in Champaign-Urbana alone, plus operations in the Chicago suburbs, Nevada, Colorado, California, and overseas. The scope of what was unwinding was not a single factory closing. It was an ecosystem collapse. Every brand Hobbico had assembled over 3 decades, Great Plains, Tower Hobbies, Axial, Arma, and more than 100 others, was now an asset in a bankruptcy proceeding, to be valued and sold to whoever made the highest offer. The company that Don Anderson had started with a distribution business and a conviction that RC kits could be built better than anyone was building them had become a line item in a court filing. Across town at Horizon Hobbies offices, the phones were quiet. They were reading the same filing everyone else was reading, and they were the only ones in the room who knew exactly what they were going to do about it. By the end of that winter, the only question left was not whether Great Plains would survive. It was whether the name would mean anything when it did. The morning of January 10, 2018 was a Wednesday. In Champaign, Illinois, January is the kind of month that strips a city down to its essentials. Bare trees, gray sky, cold that settles into concrete and does not leave until March. The Research Road facility looked the way it always looked in winter. Parking lot filling before 8, loading docks open, the interior lights visible through the high windows of the warehouse. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from any other Wednesday morning. Inside, people already knew. The Chapter 11 filing had been prepared over weeks of legal work that most employees were not privy to. But in the way of all institutional secrets, enough had leaked through the building that the announcement, when it came, landed not as a surprise but as a confirmation. The thing people had been afraid to say out loud was now in a court document. The filing could ultimately lead to the layoff of 332 employees at Hobbico's Champaign-Urbana facilities. 332 people. People who had come to work that morning with lunch pails and coffee thermoses, who had badge swiped through the same entrance they had badge swiped through for years, who knew which fluorescent light in the break room flickered and which chair at the corner workstation wobbled. People whose children had grown up knowing their parent worked at the hobby company. People whose retirement accounts had, until recently, held the promise of something real. The machines did not stop that day. A bankruptcy filing is a legal instrument, not a funeral. Products still moved. The warehouse still processed orders. The phones still rang. But the building felt different in the way that buildings feel different when the people inside them know something has fundamentally changed. A specific kind of stillness that has nothing to do with noise level and everything to do with the future. Management communications in the days that followed were careful and non-committal. The company was exploring restructuring. It was seeking buyers. It was committed to its employees and its brands. The words were accurate in a legal sense and hollow in a human one. Hobbico sent a notice to employees telling them that mass layoffs, if they happened, could start in April, affecting 332 workers at its Champaign-Urbana facilities. If they happened. The conditional tense in a sentence like that is a particular kind of cruelty. The search for a buyer produced exactly one serious bidder. On April 6th, it was announced that Horizon Hobby had cast the winning and only bid for the majority of Hobbico's assets, including all of their radio control assets as well as the building Hobbico occupied in Champaign, Illinois. The price was $18.8 million, a number that, measured against 33 years of brand building, engineering innovation, catalog distribution, and community employment, had a particular flatness to it. Horizon Hobby. The company founded in July 1985, the same year Hobbico was formed in the same city by a man who had left to start his own operation. For decades, the two companies had occupied the same industry, served overlapping customer bases, and operated within blocks of each other in Champaign without either one destroying the other. Now one of them had purchased the other out of bankruptcy court for less than the assessed value of the building it operated in. Hobbico employees were required to reapply for their jobs at Horizon Hobby before the purchase was completed. Read that sentence carefully. The people who had owned the company, through the ESOP, through years of labor and deferred compensation, were required to submit applications to their crosstown competitor in order to keep working in the same building, at the same desks, on the same product lines. Some received offers for temporary positions at reduced scope, some received nothing. Russell Daly, a former employee, was offered only a temporary job. He didn't take it. He was not alone. Former employees told reporters they were looking at minimum wage jobs to pay the bills. They drove nearly an hour and a half to speak with the press, some of them livid, all of them frustrated at the lack of communication over the preceding months. What happened to Great Plains, the brand in the acquisition, was its own kind of quiet devastation. Horizon Hobby acquired control of most Hobbico RC brands and IP, except in Great Plains manufacturing. The manufacturing identity, the engineering innovation that Anderson had built from scratch, the precision-cut airframes, the interlocked construction that had defined the brand's claim to quality, was carved out of the deal. The name that appeared on kit boxes in hobby shops across America for 3 decades was separated from the thing that had given it meaning. All of the well-liked policies Great Plains had as Hobbico's hobby shop distribution arm disappeared. The hobby shop owners who had built their businesses around the Great Plains relationship, the favorable terms, the reliable stock, the human account representatives who answered the phone, found themselves dealing with a different company operating under familiar names. The names were the same. The company behind them was not. The hobby shop owner in Ohio who had stocked Great Plains kits since 1989 closed his store the following year. He did not make an announcement. He simply did not renew the lease. The flying field on the edge of his town still exists. The men who fly there are older now. They bring their own fuel and their own parts because the shop that used to stock them is a nail salon. On the shelf in the back of one of their garages, there is still a Great Plains box. The price sticker is from a store that closed before the bankruptcy. The kit inside has never been built. Nobody has decided what to do with it. Don Anderson did not set out to build a city's economy. He set out to cut a balsa rib straight. That was the original problem. The one that had bothered him as an engineering student, that had followed him through 2 years at General Motors, that had brought him back to Champaign in 1973 with the conviction that someone had to build the machine that did not yet exist. He built it. The kits that came off that machine were better than anything else on the market, and the men who built them knew it the moment the parts fit together. Clean, precise, without argument. That was what Great Plains was, at its foundation. Not a distribution network, not a catalog, not a portfolio of acquired brands. A solution to a problem that a young engineer could not stop thinking about. The Research Road facility is occupied now. The building that housed one of the largest hobby distributors in American history did not sit empty long. Horizon Hobby acquired it as part of the bankruptcy sale and moved its own operations in. The loading docks that once processed Great Plains kits and Tower Hobby's catalog orders still function. Forklifts still move through the same warehouse floor. The lights still run on the same circuit. Different company, same address. The continuity is physical and nothing else. Of the 332 workers who received layoff notices in January 2018, the public record is incomplete on how many found comparable work. What is documented is narrower and harder. Former employees describing minimum wage fallback jobs, temporary offers declined as insufficient, frustration at the silence from management during the months the company was being sold around them. The ESOP, the retirement promise that had made Hobbico feel like something its workers owned, had lost more than 80% of its value before the bankruptcy was even filed. What remained after liquidation was distributed through the bankruptcy proceedings in the way that such things are distributed. Slowly, partially, with legal fees extracted at every step. The Great Plains name still appears in hobby catalogs. Under Horizon's ownership, some product lines carrying the brand have continued in diminished form. Whether this constitutes survival depends entirely on what you believed Great Plains was. If you believed it was a logo and a product category, it survived. If you believed it was Don Anderson's engineering philosophy, the conviction that a kit should fit together the way a well-designed machine fits together, built by people who flew what they made, then the brand on the box is a different thing from what it says it is. That is what Type C looks like from the inside. The flying fields are quieter than they were. The men who still fly, the ones who have been doing it since the 1980s, who remember when the Tower Hobbies catalog arrived in the mailbox like a seasonal event, are not being replaced at the rate they are aging out. The hobby shops that survive do so on thinner margins, with smaller footprints, serving a customer base that skews older every year. Some have shifted toward drone racing and FPV equipment, chasing a younger customer who has different expectations and different loyalties. The PT-40 trainers that introduced a generation of American men to RC flight are not in production anymore. In Champaign, the cornfields still run to the edge of things. The University of Illinois still anchors the city's identity. On the far side of town, at an address on Research Road, a building that once hummed with the particular noise of a hobby empire still stands and still operates, just under different management with different names on the door, moving different product for different reasons. Somewhere on a shelf in a garage in the American Midwest, a Great Plains box sits unopened. The price sticker is from a store that no longer exists. The parts inside still fit perfectly. They always did.